When I came to Franklin River, 1937, from Waseca, now if you check you'll find out where that is, but it's on the Lloydminster, 60 miles east of Lloydminster. I come from there out by train, went to Vancouver, and Vancouver out to the island in November of 37. But I never started falling or running the chainsaw until 38. The saws didn't come in for 1 year. After I got there, they were supposed to be there every other week, but they came from Germany, the old steel chainsaw, and they never got them. There was 7 came in, which was one of the first 7s to hit the West Coast as far as that type of chainsaw is concerned. 2-man, 135-pound saw. Took anything from a 2-foot bar to 6. But as far as falling is concerned, at them days it was something new, and it was more of a test run. A man by the name of Jack Challenger, he was really up and coming, and he realized that the old Swedes and the old crosscut men were getting less and less and less every year, so he had to find alternatives, and the chainsaws was the answer if he could put it over. And he told me personally himself, a couple of years later, that when he first started out with them, he figures he'd done everything else to make the chainsaws appear as if they were making, good in the bush. And look at him today. He proved right, too. He was 100% right. If somebody hands you a crosscut today, they'd wrap it around the boss's neck. They wouldn't use it. They won't have nothing to do with crosses. Too hard to work. But anyhow, the chainsaws come in 1938, and I started out with I had 2 or 3 different partners. I started out with my brother first. For about 2 months we worked together. Then there was another couple of us brothers, and they were just like our 2, each one of us wanted to be boss, because your brothers, there's all of a controversy going on, so they switched the machine man, the head faller, they just switched. I went with a fellow by the name of Les Davis, and my brother went with Les Davis's half-brother. It wasn't Davis. Yeah, I forget his last name now.
George Burns.
Burns, that's right, George Burns. Les and I fell for about 14 straight months, and we fell around 1 million feet a month for the 14 months. But we did not bucket. We took the bad butts off of any tree that was rotten. We long butted it up to good wood. If it had a swell butt of cedar or a swell butt spruce, which was no good, we long butted it for the buckers, and we had 3 buckers behind us. It took 3 buckers, and then we had to stop and help the buckers out in order to come towards the end of the day. Well, if we were 4 or 5 trees ahead, we measured up and bucked up 2 or 3 of the trees so that we had a clean sheet for the next morning. Now that's the first falling, but mind you, after Les left, I worked with a couple other partners for a short while, I would say we done all right, but we never got along like Les and I. Les was a first-class head faller, and there's not too many of them around that are laying the timber. That's where the difference between falling at Vancouver Island or on the west coast than falling in the interior. The interior, you have a tough time breaking the tree when you fall it, but on the coast you have a tough time to save a tree. I mean, they're so tall and so long and so heavy that without too much excuse, you got to be pretty smart laying your timber down if you don't break up the timber. And at them days, it wasn't like now. They'd go crazy, I think, if they seen the timber smashed up like it wasn't. And way back in them days, some of them guys went out on them hillsides. All they done all day is drove stumps with trees and just smashed them to smithereens. It was pitiful. But anyhow, there's a big difference between the interior and that. And another difference between the interior falling and the west coast, like I say, the timber here is scattered. For 1 acre, you might get, some of the stands in the interior here are not too bad, but there's an awful lot of them. They maybe run 15 or 20,000 board feet at that time. It was all board feet. Against 250,000 on the coast per acre. I mean, that the concentration is there, you know. That's why they could use high leads. They can't use, and here there isn't a big enough concentration in one spot. We might have a valley of timber and there's 200,000. Maybe there's 2.5 million in the valley. And in the same valley down at the coast, there'd be maybe 400 or 500 million in the valley. Makes a big difference when it comes to cost for road building and in all your skid trails not to get the timber out. When I first came to Franklin River, I moved up because when I run a machine for a year or two, they found out that I knew a little bit about motors, so they put me in charge, and I switched from Franklin River and Vancouver Island to Campbell River on Vancouver Island, where the Tyee country, you know, where the big fish caught. I was at Camp B. When I went into Camp B, I was looking after 20 saws, grinding all the chains. There was no chisel tooth chains in them days. It was the regular left-hand rider and the right-hand rider and the left-hand raker and the right-hand raker and a center raker. And that's the way the chain was put together, and it took considerable knowledge to file it. But anyhow, I didn't file them. You couldn't file them. I ground them. I had a grinder. I ground the chains, looked after all the mechanical work, got into lots of arguments, got into almost fist fights. And one day I got a message from the head man. In fact, he was a man by the name of Daly, and he was a superintendent of, there was 2 camps there, Camp A and Camp B. And he was staying in Camp A, was more or less just the maintenance end of it. You know, Camp B, where I was, had the shop, was the main logging camp. There was about 300 men there. And I get the call I should go down and talk to Mr. Daly. He wanted to see me. So I went tearing down there, and I got into the office, and there was 2 men working in his office. Or 1 man and 1 lady, I think it was, but there was 2 parties. I didn't know any of them. I had never met Daly either. And one went out the left-hand door, and the other went out the right-hand door, and I was left all alone with Mr. Daly. And I don't know, I guess he had a name of really chewing him out when I went after him, and he was going to chew me out, but didn't at that time. He didn't worry me too much, you know. I mean, the boss didn't scare me in plain English. So he went after me, he wanted to know why that he had 20 saws up in the bush and about 8 or 10 spares, and he wanted to know why there was costing $20,000 or $25,000 a month to keep the things running. Well, I said, I've been fighting for the last year, I said, for a good many months anyway. I said, to try to get a good oil to mix with the gasoline and to get them to pre-mix it for the guys, because there's half of them out in the bush that the oil they've got's got a low flash point. It burns up with the gasoline, and the saw just burns up from lack of lubrication. And I said, as long as this your head shop foreman down here insists on buying that oil, I said, you can keep on buying the parts. I said, you have no choice. I said, if you want to go in and buy a low flash point oil, with a low flash point, you'll do much better in as far as chainsaws are concerned than the repair bill. And another second thing you've got to do is make sure that there's somebody out in the bush that knows how to mix gas and oil. You don't put in a quart of oil into a 2-gallon can and fill it up with gasoline and say, oh, well, I got 1,000 feet up the mountain, it'll be mixed when I get up there. When that can is full, when they get up there, the first 3 fills, they put in straight gasoline. In the middle of the afternoon, they carrying it around in the bush with the overlogs and that, and I said it's shook up and it gets well mixed. And I said it's half gas and half oil. And the guys come in at night, and I just about get in a fist fight with them because I'm telling them to use too much oil. So I said, that is the main cause of your repair bills. Well, I'm telling you that he didn't say aye, yes, and no. He said, okay, that's good. And I went back to work, and everything was honky-dory, but I did get a good oil, and I had a guy out on the job that tended to a lot of the mixing to see that it was well mixed. Shut her off again. Some boots. But anyhow, in this camp, Camp B, about 300 men, and there was a young lad come out of university. He wasn't quite dry behind the ears yet, and he come into that office, and he was actually, I think he had a first aid ticket, but he was mainly timekeeper. But inside of 3 weeks, everybody that walked through the door, he called them by their name. He must have had a memory like an elephant, because names was duck soup to him. And to prove my point, to follow up the story, I left Camp B. I moved to Vancouver. I took up a job in the manufacturing of chainsaws, because the war come on and that shut them off, and they couldn't get any more from Germany, so they started building what they called the timber hog, which you've no doubt heard of, in Vancouver. So there's something come up when I moved to Vancouver. This is about, I'd say it was 2 years later, at least 2 years. And I walked into the logging agency, and here was this young lad, and his name was Morris. That was his last name. And he greeted me like a long-lost friend and called me by my name. Why, hello, Oscar Schmidt, and he was just run for the book, and he was gonna send me out on the job right off the bat. And I said, hold it. I didn't come here looking for a job. But anyhow, the amazing part of it was I was one of 300 men, and he remembered the name, you know. And the second thing that astonished me at that time was he said, holy smokes, he said, have you ever got a record? And I said, oh, what are you talking about, a record? Well, he said, you're a 5-star, he said. And I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, and he said, the main reason for that, he said, was old man Daly, the superintendent of Camp A in Camel River, see. Of course, he was retired by that time. He was getting pretty old, and I was working. But that goes to prove that, see, that he was supposed to be a hard-boiled nose and really, well, I guess maybe he was, but he had to be on the job he had. But he was a good superintendent as far as I was concerned. But he had given me a wonderful reference. Yeah.
Well, when you came to work at Kootenay Forest Products after you'd left Merritt, that was the first time you'd worked in this part of the country, wasn't it?
No.
Had you worked here before?
I worked in, not here first. I worked in Merritt.
Right, but you came here from Merritt.
Yeah, but I worked in Merritt. I cut 28 million feet of logs of timber in Merritt alone.
Well, I wondered whether that would have been the first time you'd have been dealing with a lot of species that grow here that don't grow elsewhere.
That's the first time that I fell in the interior within Merritt. All the falling that I had done was all on the coast. I'd done a little bit in North Vancouver in the high-priced homes. I fell a few trees for them guys, but that was just side money. But I never fell in the interior till I come to Merritt. And if you're a bush wise at the coast, the interior is just a pushover. I mean, it's nothing to it. Here you got a lot better ground. You got wide open places. Your timber is not thick like it is at the coast. It's not hard. It's hard work, but I mean, it's not as dangerous as it is at the coast. And God knows it's dangerous enough any place, but it's worse on the coast than here.
Well, could you tell me a little bit about camp life? Could you describe?
Well, as far as the camp life, when I first come to Camp B, I'll talk more about Camp B because I had more to do in camp because I was never out of camp. Mm-hmm. I'd make the odd trip out, but I was, like I say, I had a shop of my own, and I looked after the saws, and I was kept pretty busy, but I was at least in camp, and I had my dinner in camp. There's about 300 men there, and they were all individual bunkhouses, and there was 8 men to the bunkhouse, 4 on each end. There was 2 divisions in it, 3/4 of the way up. You couldn't see into the other end, but it was open above, about 6 feet up, and it was open, and in that opening there was a door out, and it was all plank walk. The whole camp was elevated, about 3 feet off the ground. Didn't matter how much it rained, you never got muddy. And the planks were all chewed up. They had regular dishes in them from the guys' cork shoes. But you never stepped on the ground. When you got into camp, you just went from bunkhouse, and there was all elevated roads. And 8 men to the bunkhouse, and in between these partitions was a big heater. At 4:30 in the morning, there's what they call the bull cook. He'd come in and he'd lit the fire for you, and that is in the colder weather in winter time. But summertime, well, naturally they'd need no heat.
Were the camps weren't quite the same here, were they? Marblehead.
Camps very similar to here, but not as the Kootenay Force had one at Marblehead that they had a bunch of trailers, 8 men in the trailer, that they got a lot. But before that was helter skelter. You 2 men here and 4 men there and 10 men there, and scattered all around different buildings. When I first hit Marblehead, it was a pretty sad looking place, but the place turned out to be the office 5 or 6 years later was where we was our bunk shack. And the place was an old stone quarry. Marblehead was, and they had all cement blocks in there. Oh boy, they had to blast them and get DH in there, and they cleaned it all out and put in the cement floor, and they made a big garage out of that for their trucks. One or the other, there was 2 big buildings, and the other, and they just used for one open side, and they stored their logging trucks in there. But that was the main camp, and it was nice. But I think I told you before when I was here that I fell at Groman Creek, and they built a big camp at Groman Creek. Kootenay Force did.
Yes.
Must have cost them, well, I'd say close to $500,000. But they didn't send a man up there all winter, and when I went there, it was just as level as that table. There wasn't a damn thing except one pump house left. Only thing was left standing. It was flattened right out. The first winter. They didn't get much use out, and they done the same thing 3 places. One up Groman Creek, one up Crawford Bay, and one in Boundary, and they flattened the whole works and were flattened out. But they did, the one in Boundary, I think they used a couple of years. They had it, but the one at Crawford Bay, I don't know, it didn't last very long either. I'm telling you, there's a lot of snow in Crawford Bay.
Would they close these camps in the winter then, and leave them?
Yeah, no logging. You take up where this one was up here, I dare say there'd be 25 feet of snow. It was up high.
When would they open the camp?
The one in Coffee Creek wasn't quite as high, but it was back far enough that now, last couple of 3 years, you don't think, oh, there's not much snow, but I'm telling you that it can come again. When I moved to Nelson here in 1951, right beside me here, there was a forestry man living. And I asked him what the average snowfall was here, and he said around 12 feet. Well, there's only been about twice that I've seen that quantity of snow since we moved to Nelson. And since when was the last big snow? About 65, somewhere around there, we had a real bad winter.
63, I believe, Oscar, when the kids were at university when they came home.
Yeah.
We couldn't even get a taxi here
the snow was,
the bus.
The snow, I'm telling you. There was one winter it was one of them winters that was 52 or 53 was pretty bad too.
The car, tops of the cars.
I had a car and a big 1-ton parked out there, and you couldn't see either one of them for the snow had piled up on the boulevard. Hit them both. There's lots of snow if it can come yet in this country. Is there anything else? Now, what was the other one that you said something about?
Well, I wonder what the routine of the faller was, what the day was like. When you got up in the morning, did you have some things to do to get ready?
Well, it was got up and once you when I first started, that was a greenhorn, and I had no trouble waking up in the morning. When I did, my bed was loaded down with cork shoes and books and oranges and everything else that was in the other three guys that heaved at me because I groaned so much through the night because I wasn't used to the work, and it was hard on. Boy, it was tough.
Well, when you got up here and you were working as a faller for KFP, could you describe your routine a bit?
Well, I mean, some places, every place is different. And if you're working out of Marblehead, they had a camp. But I supervised there. The time that I was falling in Marblehead, and like I said, when we first went up there, we stayed in what turned out to be the first aid and office afterwards. It was just, any old building we could get that they could rig up for a bed. You had your own sleeping bag, and if you didn't like the mattress, well, you went and got another armful of straw someplace and thickened it up. I mean, there's very few. Later on, they had mattresses for all the bed, but most of the camps were all straw bunks. And another thing, as far as Marblehead is concerned, they had a real good kitchen and a real good cook. Then if you're working in Crawford Bay where there was no camp, you had they lined it up for you. We used to, when we worked up Woodbury, or not Woodbury, but Crawford Bay, we stayed at a party by the name of Derbyshires, which was bought out by the golf company that's in there now, that Kootenay Springs. We had our meals there, and like I say, there was no camp. You kind of hunted for a place where you could use as a bunkhouse, whether it was an office, an old granary, an old house, or something. If you could find one that's enough to hold 3 or 4 guys, you piled in there as many as could get in. Later on, when I fell a tie, I fell for a fellow by the name of Julie Rogers and tie, and I cut quite a bit of timber in there for him. I must have logged about 2 or 3 million feet for him, and we had it all on decks, none of it hauled, and we had an old trapper's cabin that was way up there in the mountains, and we stayed in that. We had a cook. We done all right. And Rogers, later on, the road was improved up there, and then they had a tough time to get the logs because I found them up against 2 trees on a fairly steep, and I start and get up a little ways, and then I put cables back. Put cables on the trees and kept going up there, and just putting them in there, and there was one pile that pretty close to 1 million feet in one bunch. But when they went to haul them out, they had to just reach so many, and then they had to build another road down, a branch road along the hillside to take another 200,000 or 300,000 out, and then they built another one to get the rest. I think they called me everything under the sun. But I mean, that's what Rogers wanted, so that's what he got. But in order to hold the piles in that big pile, you could find a fairly steep slope and two big trees down below, well, you're all right. So you just cleared off everything else and let the logs roll down to them 2 trees, and when they got so high, then you put cables on the trees to hold them.
In these operations, where you were doing more than falling then? You were.
I was at that there. We were falling, and we were skidding them both. We had a couple of teams' horses in there, but we had just we didn't own the horses. We had them rented.
With it.
But we were mainly doing the falling, but we did look after the whole works of the skidding. We were responsible for the in the deck.
These would be short logs.
Yes, the longest was 40 feet.
And how many horses would they use?
Oh, we had two teams. That's all. There wasn't real big timber.
So
If it was a real big log, then instead of cutting it 40 on it, it's 20 out of it, so you could move with horses. No, that was not for Kootenay Forest. That was just one on my own, a tie that I'd done when I first came here, and then I like I told you before, I filled the first timber and the last timber in Groman Creek. But the camp life was different in every situation you went. If you went to Marblehead, to Woodbury, they were all different. But the company, for a good many years, supplied a camp and some type of shelter for to stay in, through the week. And you come home every week. You stayed out for the week and come in on a Saturday night. Went out even after I started supervising. Done the same thing. The camps at Woodbury, at Boundary, they had no camp. There was absolutely no camp in Boundary. You had no choice. You would go to Port Hill and back.
Did you work 6 days a week then?
Yeah, when I started out, I think we worked 7 days a week on the coast, but up here just 6.
What time would you quit on a Saturday?
No, it was Friday, Oscar. You'd come in, not Saturday. You'd come home Friday night and go out Sunday morning.
Yeah, well, that's what I said here, but not at the coast. I think we worked the odd Saturday at the coast, but not after I come to the interior. Just Saturday and Sunday off. We come in Friday night, and went out Sunday night.
Did most of the people come down to Nelson or come into Nelson?
Well, they did for the weekend.
Yeah.
But there was some at Marblehead. There was some that locals there. Well, naturally, they just went home. But the locals, some of them didn't even stay in the camp. They only 4 or 5 miles to drive, and they come every morning. They commuted from home. Because if they stayed in camp, you were charged, I think at that time, $2.50 a day for room and board. But that's, as far as I'm concerned, is a pretty good deal. Nobody at home, not myself or nobody else, could put up a meal that they put up in them camps. The average family could never afford it. You had about 4 or 5 different varieties of meat, and an orange beside your plate every morning, and apples on the table, pies. You had not only 3 different varieties of pies, T-bone steaks, about 4 times a week. Nobody knows. And the guys that really meow about the food. But the guys that meowed about the food, they never had nothing to eat at home. No. But it was, as far as I'm concerned, you asked Frances, she was up and had a meal or two in the logging camps, the odd time we'd go in there. A fellow by the name of Jmaeff, he cooked there for 5 or 6 years for Kootenay Forest, and he was a wonderful cook.
You haven't told me too much about the people that you worked with. I'd be interested to hear about some of the people that you worked with here.
Well, I work with some good ones and some bad ones. You get along. If you're going to get along in the world out, and especially when you're supervisor, you got maybe 3 or 4 supervisors in the camp. There might be, you might have. We're logging 2 different valleys. I might have one valley, and there's another supervisor's got another valley, and you look after the roads, the fallers, the hauling of the logs. You look after the whole works in that branch. But another place, there might be, they've got all their eggs pretty well in one basket. Well, then, like for quite a few years when I started that, I just bullbucked. I was just looked after the fallers. And the other guys, I didn't have nothing to do with, except maybe when the boss went on holidays. Well, then you might have to look after the entire camp. But that was just in holiday time. No, it's Marblehead was first-class camp. The best camp they had. The Woodbury one was a nice camp too, that mining camp. They also had one out of Kaslo up there was another mining camp up at what they call 9 Mile Creek or something like that. It was about 12 miles out of Kaslo, and that was a mining camp too, but it was a real nice camp. The mines all shut down, and the buildings are there, and the company just rented them. Bondi was, like I say, they built a beautiful camp there, but it got flattened out, so from then on they just commuted, and it worked right out of Creston. I stayed in Creston in the hotel. You get up every morning about 5:30 and take off for work. So, restaurants in Creston, they accommodated the loggers. They got up, you could have a 5 o'clock breakfast if you wanted it. Most of them made it 6 o'clock, and on the job at 7:30. And I looked after the complete camp, all the falling and the skidding and everything else in Boundary. An old guy on there by the name of Bonderoff was a contractor. He didn't have nothing to do with the fallers. We had to go in there falling, but he had to contract skidding with the cats. Him and his one son had a cat each. That's where they logged up on Groman Creek here too. When they first started up, they had two TD-14s in there that they had rented. One was Gould, and I forget the other guy's name. They both had TD-14s. They were both skidding in there. I was doing the falling, and they were doing the skidding.
There were no rubber-tired skidders then?
They didn't have any of them. They did have before I left the bush, yes, but not when I first started. They were just starting to introduce them a little bit into the bush.
And were the international, the TD-14s, was that?
That's the cat.
Popular?
Yes, that's one of the most popular there was in the international. The cats were the big one, the mainstay, but then there was in the international, the TDs 14s and TD 15s. They stood up pretty good in the bush too. I wouldn't say that they stood up as well as the cats, but they stood up relatively well.
And cheaper machine to buy.
Yeah, cheaper. Yes. Yes, they were quite a bit cheaper.
Did KFP own its own skidders as well? Did they have bulldozers as well? The company? Did KFP own its own heavy equipment as well?
Well, I think they had 2 or 3 trucks, hauling trucks, and they owned a D8 and a couple of D7s because they used them. They built the roads. That was their road building equipment. And later on, they invested in a shovel for swamplands, for real bad mucky. And then that shovel would go through a swamp and build a road, and where a cat, all they do is go right out of sight. But that shovel had worked on pads, see. And as soon as he got off the one, he just turned around and hooked on and swung it around, and he just kept going that way there. And he'd build a road through a swamp and ditch on each side or one side, whichever is necessary, and culverts. And in 3 days you could drive a truck over that. The water all drained right out of it, see. So, but that was real good investment. That big shovel for swampland road building. You put a D8 in there, and I'm telling you, got the biggest mud pie you ever seen in your life. The more they wiggle, the deeper they go.
Can you think of a particular cat operator to describe to me?
Steve Gretchan was one of the main, and I'm telling you that he run a D8 for them, and he could make a road just as level as this rug. And never a wave runner nut. He's just beautiful blade man. He was one of their head road builders, George Gretchan. Yeah, he was really a good cat operator. They've had other good cat operators too, but George was one of the better ones. You could laugh, but you'd see him. He'd get on one of these little TD4s, for decking logs. And I'm telling you, he could run a log all the way across a big landing with that blade, and he'd just get kicking, and then he could just know exactly what he was doing. He could take it from here, A to B, and never lose it, And the average guy gets in there, and the log takes off, and he has to back up and frig around. And George, he could just play with it. Looked like he was playing. He knew what he was doing. Yeah. He was the main one. They had a good grader man. They had a good powder man for blasting and that, by the name of Vern Nelson. They always had a helper with him, and they done any place they hit rock, he drilled it and blasted it. And George come along with the D8 and push her over the bank. But they had 2 or 3 other men that worked, that were good. But George was the mainstay, and he run the company cat. And then they would, after George left, in fact, George passed away suddenly, and then they got another man in, he was a good too. He come from Ainsworth. See, I can't think of his last name now. But that's pretty well logging. I mean, I don't know if there's any other particular branch that you want to know anything about. But I told him about Groman Quick and the high lead the last time it was here.
No.
That was Waldy.
Oh, Waldy there, yeah.
Waldy got that up in there.
Forest products and
yeah, but that's not enough. There's not enough concentration of timber in any one place for a high lead in this country. They found that out. Didn't take it very long either.
Are there Forest Service people that you remember?
Well, the Forest Service, the only time that the Forest Service ever had much to do with them was when I was falling, and the company would tell you, oh, don't you cut anything smaller than a 15-inch stump, and don't you cut anything smaller than a 9-inch top, and all this, you know. That was their rules, and then the force would come out and contradict it, so you had to kind of satisfy both of them. One said, you go down to 12-inch stumps, you go to a 6-inch top. And the company come along, we haven't got no, don't do that. Don't cut smaller than 9-inch. But I mean, the forestry, in the end, the forester won out. I mean, they made them go down to 6-inch tops. And if they didn't, if they left them in the bush, then they went back and scaled them and charged it right back to them. Yeah. Because all it was is, of course, like I told you before, you know, that's the old way was, it was just absolutely high grading. Nothing was utilized. It was all high graded and smashed down, and then touch a match to her, and the rainy season comes and burn her up. Let her go. Burn up millions of feet of cedar in this country. My God, they wish they had now. Because cedar lay there for 20 years, it's still good. Once it's burned up, it's no good.
Is that in the bottomlands of the Duncan and the Lardo?
Yes. That's where some of the main cedar was, yes.
Shell cedar.
If you've been up that road, you could see a lot of the old cutting, a lot of the old burn. I imagine it's all growing up now. You can't see much. But they had what they called the Luth Hall Park up there. At one time, you know, now it's kind of gone to pot. I don't know if somebody took out the big trees in that or not.
They also called it John Fingers Forest.
Yeah, well, that's Luthon. He was the one that named it Luthold Park, because this was Luthold that owned Kootenay Forest when I come to town. Mm-hmm. And he had bought it from a fellow by the name of Patterson.
Did Lutholds ever come out in the bush to see where?
Luthold, I didn't know the man even.
No.
Just by name. Come from Deer Park, Spokane. I didn't know the man. I met the head guy or one of them, I should say, from Eddie Match, that was the owner. You know, Eddie Match was the one that owned it when Kootenay called it Kootenay Forest. But
did they come out on a tour?
Yeah, well, they come out and come right into the bush. Old Shukin, he was the superintendent here then, and the operation, he will come out with him. Yeah. No, but that's Luthold. You know, he wasn't. The mill was sold not too long after I came here, so maybe Luthold might have been out too, but not when I was working, because I would just fall in there, and he wouldn't come anywhere near a faller. I'd follow a trail on him.
Some of the contractors who worked for KFP have said that once they came to work for the company as on contract and had great liabilities in their investments in machinery, that
the leading two contractors, two brothers by the name of Voykin boys, Jack and Alec Voykin, they had 2 D6s, and I think they'd done a better job of logging for Kootenay Forest than any other contractor they ever had. But they had dozens of contractors. I mean, they had Gould, they had, oh gosh, I'd have to do a little thinking to remember most of the names, but that Bonderoff was a guy that was down in Boundary. The Voykins, they were never in Boundary. They worked Coffee Creek. And they stayed in the Western Mines there, the camp there. They were with them. They done most of their logging for the company in Lardo. And that big cedar up there that you see up along the road on both sides of the road, and if you ever been on the back road up in Meadow Creek there, all that country was logged. The Voykins were in on it. They were really a nice pair of boys, and they were both real smooth operators on cats. And they looked after that. They owned them, and they looked after them well, too.
Sometimes the contractors would get into trouble because they couldn't make enough to cover their payments. They were fighting the company all the time. It's just the same as the truckers. They were continually in the fallers. There was one continual round of haggle over price. And the same for the haulers, the same for the guys from contract. They'd get a contract, and it changed every strip. You might have, like I said, a valley. It might have 5 million feet in it, or a flat, but it's a timber sale. There might be 5 million in it. There might be 25 million in it. Well, if there's 25 million in it, they were there for maybe all summer, and if they was low land, there was a winter show. So they kept most of them lowland shows for winter. They went up the mountains in the summertime, and as soon as the snow got 10 feet deep up there, well, they come back into the valleys. And the Voykins, they were good. They'd plow snow. They'd think nothing. They log for the company and bucking 8 feet of snow. You know. But a cat is a funny piece of equipment, you know. The guy is a good operator. He plows a little bit off the top and it backs down the rest, you know. He just goes like a scared cat. Yeah. 8 feet of snow, and you'd think it, but he's running on top of half of it and just plowing a little bit off the top. That is, I'm talking about skid trails. Do that. If he runs around like that through the day, you know, and it always gets a little nippier at night, and it goes back the next morning, that's hard as a rock. Pack that snow down, the next morning he's got a good skid trail. So a lot of guys that get smart, you know, they run all through the bush, you know, the day before, and they'd leave them. They'd just run intentionally around. And then the next day, they get in there, they run around perfectly nice, hard skid trails. Making the switch from horse logging to cat logging, would the same people have sold their horses and bought cats, or did it mean a whole new group of people came to work?
See, they work conjunction for quite a while. When the cats first come out, the horses and the cats work together. See,
Can you explain that? I don't understand.
The cats would you'd say there was a flat of timber, and the faller goes in there. Well, there might be logs in there that the buck, if the faller knows there's a cat, and he isn't going to cut a nice big tree that's 3 feet on the butt, he isn't going to cut it up into 20-foot logs so the horses can. He'll make a 32 or a 40-foot log out of that, and the cat can haul it in. And the cat maybe takes the first 2 logs, and the horses will take the next 2. See? The horses look after all the tops and the small logs, and the cat looks after the. Worked out good. They was a good combination. A lot of people won't admit that, but I know better. They're really a good combination. and the horses never done any damage. They're as far as the ground, all this good thing about the cats, believe it or not, any place a cat run, up comes new trees. They push the seeds into the ground and work up the ground a little bit, and then any place you go back 2 years later, wherever cats run, there's just thousands of little trees like that. So the cat's good for something, but a lot of guys don't like it because they're knocked down so much small stuff, which the horses don't. But if you talk about horse logging now, well, somebody think you're a little bit daffy on the head.
So you were using horses and cats together for a few years?
No, I used only horses. I worked beside a cat. Another guy had a cat, and skidded some of the heavier stuff, But most of the logging I done in Thai with horses, and in Nicola Valley, I owned the teams. I had 2 teams, and it wasn't big timber, It was horse logging. The odd big yellow pine you got, well, they just cut them into shorter logs.
So if that worked so well, why did the horses phase out?
Well, because nobody wants to drive horses. You go and try to hire a teamster today, and a teamster, they don't know what you mean. As far as the teamsters now, well, that teamsters union, that's the only thing that's the only teamsters left. No, it takes a guy, and you take horses that you have logged with, they get smart pretty fast, horse not dumb by any means. And you're skidding on a slope, Some places I've seen guys take one horse, and he just wheeled down that skid trail just on a dead gallop, and he'd stay ahead of the log. And he'd take it right out onto the land, and the guy on hook, and go right straight back to the bush for another one. No man with him at all. That's just, I used to have a black dog that done that too. I'd just open up the door and say, fill up the wood box, and as long as there was split wood out there, she'd bring her in.
A dog?
Put her in the wood box, yeah.
Carry it with her in her mouth?
Yeah, well, that was Trixie, I had her when she was only that long.
The 2 boys and 16? And the 2 boys, and each father with them.
Beautiful dogs.
And we were in Merritt. Lived in Merritt.
That's great.
I actually want a plaque at the dog trial, but one instance here, we got that thing on?
Yep. One
instance here when there was a fellow by the name of Gordon Hamlin was the road foreman.
Yeah.
He was doing some blasting for the company down on their boom ground here, just the other side of the mill, where they had their boom ground. Mm-hmm. So I was out there, where any place I went, the dog went too. She traveled with me for about 12 years, I guess. So he blasted his stump. My God, you should have seen the whitefish come up. There was just dozens of them. So I said, get 'em, Trixie. So Trixie piles out, and she picked up every fish. They weren't dead, They just knocked out from the blast. We all had a nice big feed of fish anyway. I forget how many I brought home. And I gave Gordon a bunch. There was another guy there too, I forget who. Oh, Johnny Millen.
So did Trixie go in the bush with you when you were falling?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. When I was falling, she'd go, if I told her to stay with my lunch kit, that's where she'd stay. Yeah.
She forgot her, or she went off somewhere, see? And you forgot her.
Well, there was one night in Merritt that I was falling well about 4 miles out in the bush. And she took off. She must have, I don't know, she just went hunting on her own. Quitting time come, and I called and I called and I called and I hunted, and that's why I come home. Took off my toolkit. I had a belt around, like the carpenters you wear for all the tools, If something went wrong with the saw, I just set her down on the stump and worked her over. Had all the tools. And I carried her.
Cried and cried, and he had to separate him and back out. And here she was.
She was cuddled right up beside my toolkit and the power saw. She's gonna stay there all night, I guess. But she went out, she got on the road to some grouse someplace, and she was interested in hunting. She forgot about quitting
It's a wonderful dog.
She was a smart girl.
17 years.
Lab?
Yeah, black lab.
Yeah, we got a good many birds with that dog.
Yeah.
I used to hunt quite a bit. Go to the prairie, and go to Tabor, and Strathmore out of Calgary.
So what would you carry with you? You'd have, other than the saw?
Oh, you mean in the bush?
Yeah.
You have your axe. In the wintertime, you have a shovel, because you got to shovel them down. And your wood sack. And sometimes you carry the little fire extinguisher on my belt. But the whole works the way. And then you always had a tool. I always had a toolkit. Sometimes I'd carry them in an old lunch kit. Sometimes I had like I say, I had a regular bag made, but they only last so long they wear out. But one time I remember in Lardo. Now this was another black lab, but it was not Trixie. It wasn't the female. This was a male. Weighed, he was a big dog. He was a lot heavier than Trixie. And he just loved to pack too. And he could pack, I'm telling you, 10, 15 pounds was nothing to him. He'd take it in his teeth and up with his head and just prance. He just loved to pack some. So I give him my axe, my toolkit. And he packed that all the way for 2.5 miles down the mountain to the truck. Bet your life. He could sure pack.
Was he your regular dog?
Yeah, he was my black lab, and I hired a fellow by the name of the Goose Off to fall in Lardo. And we went up in the mountain, it was up Meadow Creek, up the road up to Meadow Mountain. And they dumped the tree on the dog. He was a big, strong guy, and he grabbed the butts, when the trees start to snap and crack, and he would shake it and growl, and, that was his fun, Thought he was, but this day, I said, get out of there, because I was afraid the tree might twist and hit him. Get out of there, and he run right around underneath it, and I screamed at him. He run right onto the tree. And I screamed, and when I screamed at him, he run straight away right underneath the tree. Just as, and a holler, and the more I screamed, he knew. He looked this way, and the tree is straight over the top. I never seen it, killed him stone dead. First tree that guy fell, he killed my dog. But I couldn't blame him. It was the dog's fault. But that was the end of him. I had him about 5 or 6 years. He was a beautiful dog. The U.S. France was When I first got the dog, I got him from Clario, and he had run wild. He had sold him for some guy up in the cusp. And the guy didn't have time to teach him anything, so he just spent the summer on the beach with the kids. And I didn't know this. Of course, when I got him, I had to be pretty rough with him for first 6 months, you know, to get him to tame it down, because he just run right over you, you know, and think nothing of it. But I smartened him up pretty fast. But the story I wanted to tell you is, geez, there's so doggone many now. I forgot the one I was.
Is that the one that you jumped on the truck with the men?
Oh yeah, I had a pickup, and there was 2 crummies, and the crummies each held about 25 men, and coming down Meadow Mountain, and it was raining and everything, muck and everything soaked, and the guys all wet. And halfway down the hill, I never went ahead of the crummies. Always come out of the bush at last to make sure there was some guy left. Well, I'd have to go back and get him anyway, so I always hung around, you know, kind of poked down. I come down just before a big draw and a big curve in a bridge. There was a crummy pulled off the side of the road, and all the guys out in the rain and the muck. And so I stopped, and they said, "Oh, the crummies broke down." So they never asked me if they could. There's 2 got in the cab the fast as they could, because they got. Well, my dog was out of luck, see. He rode wherever I told him in the back. And it didn't matter when I left home here, running away from the story, but when I left home, the higher the load, he'd always get right up on top of me. He was just like a motorcycle driver, you know. He would just take all the curves. It didn't matter. The higher it was, the better he liked it. But anyway, the guys, my old truck went. I thought, geez, I'm sure the springs went right down the axles. They just went like that, because there must have been at least 15 or 18 men climbing the back there. You can figure they're all soaking wet, so they all weigh about 200 pounds or better. God. But I put her into gear, gonna start out, and I looked in the mirror and I see old Prince, you know. He was way up the road there, all full of mud, and he heard me put her into gear, you know. Well, he just turned and he come down that road, and he just flew into the air, and he lit right in the middle of that 25 men in the back end there, you know, and swear and curse and the damn dog. And one another guy says, "When do you think he's gonna walk, just because we're in the back end here, you know?" So they all parted enough to let him down, and by their feet anyway, and I took the whole works in one shot. But what a dog! I'm telling you, he was just soaking wet and mud. Jumped right in amongst them, lit right on him. Real heavy in the chest, front end, taper back, tail just like a rasp. Come right, but it's that big around at his body and right to a point, just real. Oh, he was a purebred black lab, and smart as a whip, but he was never taught a thing. And that's too bad, you know. Like just about my youngest son was with me. He thought I was going to kill him. I treated him pretty rough, after a while. He just smart. All I had to do was talk harsh to him, and he would listen, you know, and then I'd say it's okay and jump right up and kiss you right now. He never held a grudge. You could kick the tar right out of him.
He threw this one out of the trucks after the bully work when he came over.
Well, I didn't know the score. She's knocked me right out of the pickup, I'm telling you. Yeah, next time I was waiting for him. Yeah. God, I pulled up at the curb door. I didn't think anything of it. He was sitting on the seat. Well, I put my hand and I just cracked the lock on the door, and he hit me. And I went right out. I'm going to tell you, he just knocked me right out of the truck. I landed on all fours right on the boulevard. Well, the son of a gun, I thought, my God. The next time I cracked the door and was waiting for him. But he was going to do the same thing, but he didn't. I worked him over pretty good in the cab. I said, you sit and don't you ever make a move until I'm out, and I'll tell you when to get out. There's no trouble. No trouble. You could learn, but he was old enough to it took a little persuading to make him toe the mark.
Yes, the boys wanted to know what happened to Dad, because they'd always be waiting for Dad, come home. We used to come home around 5:36 for supper from camp, and they were always out there waiting for him. And this had happened, and he came and, Mommy.
The dog sure knocked me out.
On the ground. Oh my God.
Got up there spitting and sputtering and swearing.
Oh. I ran out to see whether he got hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were the days. And Trixie, oh, she was really a pet and a nice dog. And our youngest would always play with her. And so one evening, he took Dad's work shirt. When he came home, put it on Trixie and on her legs and that. Took his hat and put it on. Took his pipe and put it in his mouth.
Sit her on a chair. She'd sit on any chair you told her to.
And took pictures of her.
Oh,
Honestly.
he was quite a dog. I'm telling you, he could do anything. Had more. I don't know if she had much. Prince was pretty smart too, but he didn't have a chance, like Trixie. I trained her from baby on, But Prince, he was a year and a half old, and old Clary Hughes says, you can have him, absolutely nothing. The guy gave me $50 for him when he was teeny. He said he's a purebred, but, well, he knew he just run wild. He packed rocks 10 feet. When Frances opened the back door, she couldn't open the goddamn door. He had about 10 great big boulders, some weighed 10 pounds, packed right on the back steps, right on the back door.
I thought it was someone playing a prank on us, because I was always home with the boys when Dad was away, and someone was playing a prank on us. And so anyway, I don't forget now, it was a weekend, and the dog happened to be out all night. And in the morning, it was around 5 or 5:30, I got up to go to the bath, and I thought I heard a thump at the door. And here was French. So then we knew it was him that was carting these rocks and putting them in front. It was either at the front door or at the back door.
Oh,
a retriever, a rock retriever.
Yeah.
Well, no, but that's where he, like I say, he spent all summer playing with the kids. And they throwed rocks in the water, and as long 20 feet deep, he'd dive 20 feet and bring up a tin can. That's the only dog I ever seen in my life, but he could dive just like a human being. Mm-hmm. He'd be up on a wharf and there'd be 4 feet, and you'd throw a shiny can, and there'd be 12 feet of water. Look, all you had to say is get her, and he'd just go straight in, just like a fish, go right down there and grab that can and come up and just as proud as punch. But he learnt that diving with his packing rocks. See. The kids used to throw rocks out and then he'd bring them back. See. That's where he got picking rocks.
So you trained him to carry your axe and your kit?
Well, I just about kicked his head off, pardon the language, for packing rocks. I just broke him entirely of rocks. He wouldn't touch a rock. After I had him for 6 months, but he always had to pack something. And if you didn't give him a little stick, he'd pick up one 10 feet long, and he couldn't get in between the trees, so he'd get so mad. So I used to always, the minute I got in the bush, I'd pick up a nice little chunk like that, and I'd give it to him. And he'd pack that all day. If he dropped it, the minute if I was doing something, he'd pick it right up, and he'd have that same stick come night. He'd have that same stick. Oh yeah. If I didn't give him something, then he'd pick up big stuff, and I couldn't get along. That's why he packed my lunch kit and my axe. I give him the axe. I put it right close to the head, right single-bitted, right next to his teeth, so that it wouldn't tip him. Otherwise, it'd tip him. And the kit weighed about 10 pounds, and he packed them both. He wanted something to pack, so I gave him something to pack. I had quite a load coming out of the bush. I had a shovel and the power saw. I forget what else. I know I had 2 or 3 articles, and I gave a couple to him, but he packed her all away. The axe got away on him one time. He didn't hang on until I slipped, so I had to push it back, straighten up, otherwise, it twists its head. I shot a goose at the lardo at the far end of the lake, and he got the goose. It wasn't complete dead, but he got it, and come back, and he come up a bank there about 30 feet, and a big blast of boulders, and he'd come up, and he'd turn the goose this way so he could see, and they'd put one foot on that big boulder, and he'd go the other way, put the other, and then he'd just come up all the way on that real big blasted rock. He'd come right straight up there, and he'd turn the goose from side to side, like that there, and the goose weighed 13 pounds. But he'd back nothing to it.